So 2-10 curve, 24 basis points. What do you think that means?
I think it's important to recognize the 2 to 10 curve, the slope of the yield curve. I don't think of it as a predictor of a recession. I think it causes recessions by squeezing the marginal lender. Now, we all know monetary policy works with long and variable lag, so it's hard to predict, as some of the clips you showed point out. But what happens is when the yield curve gets flat, the incentive to lend decreases. And so people want to stop lending. And that slowly dries up the source of credit to the economy. And it's hard to predict exactly when that happens, but that's the challenge. What's even more difficult this time is the Fed is really doing something to both ends of the yield curve. Their gentle telegraphed interest rate increases, I would point out just like 2004, 5, and 6, is not having much impact on the long end. The traders all take comfort the Fed's not going to surprise us. But then the Fed is tapering its balance sheet by running stuff off at the short end, which puts pressure in the Treasury market as the Treasury refinances that. So the Fed is squeezing this yield curve itself, partly intentionally, and I think partly without really thinking about it very carefully.
The question we wind up hearing a lot is this time different? And unless you're Neil Kashkari, a lot of people say, yes, this time is different. And I want to point out one thing that really does look different, Peter. If you come inside the Bloomberg, it's the 2-10 spread. It's those white bars. But the yellow bars is the real Fed funds rate, which is still negative versus the other times where you've seen an inversion where it's positive. Does that make a substantial difference?
Well, we're not inverted yet, and it may take a long time. It may take another year or two. But eventually, it's going to choke off the supply of credit. I mean, in January of 2000, I remember no one less than Secretary of the Treasury Larry Summers assuring everyone to pay no attention to the flat yield curve. We had a recession within a year. And so eventually it catches up with us. The lags are hard to predict.
So how do you make of the fact that then the back end, though, is dominated more structurally in terms of the Treasury needs to borrow more, we need to fund a fiscal deficit and all of that? So how do you make the connection there?
The front end is where the Treasury has to refinance. The big refinancing needs coming from the Fed shrinking its balance sheet, all by maturing, and the Trump tax cuts. The Treasury has to refinance that on the short end. It's just mechanically, that's where they have all the auctions. I think the problem, which Jay Powell is working on, he's trying to pull back from forward guidance. The statement is much fewer words. He talks about a balanced outlook. But eventually, they've got to stop telling us what the next 2 rate moves are going to be, because you can't pre-announce it's our last tightening move. You can't pre-announce we're about to ease, because if you did that, you just eased. So this is the tricky part of the process for Jay Powell. And the question is, I think today, is he going to foreshadow that? I'm going to look for how many times he uses the word uncertain.
Right.
I think he's going to use that word a lot.
Well, what are they going to use more? Is he going to use a good, strong economy more or uncertain more?
Well, he's going to say both. He's going to say good economy, balanced outlook, and then he's going to start telegraphing uncertainty, because he's got some members of his committee who are already worried about the flat yield curve and others who aren't. So they can't imagine them publishing their dot plot and having a third of the dots go up, a third go sideways, and a third go down. What's the market going to make of that?
I have no idea.
Right? No, and that's not something they want to do.
But I think it also raises the question, sort of the long term, what's the neutral rate going to be? And is the neutral rate going to be able to rise, or is it not? And that they need to, that is less data dependent right now in terms of headlines on trade and more forward looking. So how do you handle that?
Well, that's why I think they've got to stop this forward guidance. They would be much better off, as your clip from Jamie Dimon said, if they were getting a parallel shift in the yield curve. It was all going up together. Then the incentive to lend is still there while they're gradually withdrawing the stimulus from the economy. Flatten the yield curve too quickly, you start taking that credit out faster than you think.